Good morning, everybody. Looks like we've got a great group with us this morning. Sorry, we got a little bit of a late start. There are a few technical difficulties on our end, but we can just go ahead and kick this right off. So I am clearly not Vanessa Chan, who was promised to introduce, but she is finishing up what may be your final meeting with the secretary this morning. I think it's going over a little bit. So I am her principal deputy in the Office of Technology Transitions, and a real privilege to kick this webinar off with the one and only Jigar Shah, director of our loan programs office. So Jigar and I will do a little bit of a opening quick discussion, and then we'll hand this off to the authors of the Virtual Power Plant Report to talk through a really exciting release here that we're happy to be talking to you about this morning. So thank you again for joining us. We're going to dive into the insights from DOE's recently published Liftoff Report on virtual power plants, VPPs, as we'll refer to them throughout. And this is the first big 2025 update that we're here to talk to you about, which is exciting. It builds on the VPP Liftoff Report published in September of 2023 and includes new data on how VPPs are helping address the mounting challenges that the power grid faces nationally. This update also highlights the incredible progress that has occurred since the initial report was published, with information on over 75 real-world examples of VPP deployments and VPP enabling actions, and information on over 60 new VPP resources from DOE and the broader industry. So this liftoff update is part of the DOE's ongoing Pathways to Commercial Liftoff initiative, focusing on enhancing collaboration between the public and private sectors to advance commercialization of critical energy solutions. Huge data-driven effort, and it starts with deep engagement with the private sector, and that involves experts from all of DOE, the national labs, to develop a common fact base. The goal is to get everyone, industry, investors, inventors, academia, government at all levels, on the same page so that we can catalyze and accelerate the clean energy transition. This perspective underscores DOE's vision of a private sector-led, government-enabled energy transition. The Liftoff reports are designed to be dynamic, evolving documents to reflect new insights from industry experts and shifts in the commercialization landscape. This 2025 VPP update is an example of how we're building on the original 2023 Liftoff report to share the latest market insights and resources. All Liftoff reports are accessible at liftoff.energy.gov, where you can also find recordings of our past webinars. This 2025 VPP update is coming at a critical time as big shifts are happening across the grid. In particular, demand growth from data center development and AI, a surge in manufacturing investments with over 900 new and expanded manufacturing facilities announced as of December 2024, and electrification of cars and buildings. Meeting these growing power demands while continuing to provide reliable and affordable power to American households is critical. So with that, Jigar, I want to bring you into this here. Can you provide a bit more color on these challenges and how VPPs can help address them to advance a reliable, affordable, and resilient energy future?
Thanks, Marcos. Since the original VPP Liftoff report was published, the near-term pressures on the U.S. electricity grid have intensified. Peak demand is growing rapidly. After 2 decades of flat electricity demand, peak demand is expected to increase from about 800 gigawatts in 2024 to around 900 gigawatts by 2030, driven in large part by data center development, reshoring American manufacturing, and electrification of transportation and heating. Now, demand growth is a good thing. It reflects economic development and progress, but rapid growth in electricity demand requires solutions that can be deployed rapidly. Recent history suggests that it can take years, sometimes a decade, to build large utility grid-scale assets, and the demand hitting the grid does not want to wait. At the same time, the utility investments into outdated approaches to growing distribution grid capacity have led to double-digit rate increases in everyday citizens. Meanwhile, extreme weather events are placing extraordinary pressure on aging grid, leading to power outages for communities all over the country. And I just want to take a moment here to recognize the devastation that communities in Southern California are facing in the midst of severe wildfires, and convey my gratitude to the people and organizations that are supporting these communities through this difficult time. These near-term pressures on the grid require proven solutions that can be deployed rapidly and at scale. This is where virtual power plants come in. Virtual power plants are solutions that can be deployed in less than 6 months to maximize the use and value of our existing grid infrastructure at dramatically lower cost to ratepayers. and ensure a reliable, resilient, and secure grid for all Americans. VPPs provide valuable peak shaving benefits to meet rising peak demand. Because they can be deployed to do this in less than 6 months, they can accelerate the interconnection of new economic development opportunities instead of making them wait up to 3 to 4 years. Because they shift power demand from peak hours to low demand hours, they increase grid utilization and the value of these existing assets that Americans have already paid for. The business as usual approach that worked in a world without demand growth and extreme weather won't work going forward. Utilities, regulators, policymakers, and industry partners all have a role to play to adopt an innovation mindset to accelerate the deployment of virtual power plants and serve the near-term needs of American citizens.
Thanks, Sugar. And we're starting to see industry leaders really step up here. This update highlights over 75 case studies of grid stakeholders taking action. For example, NRG Energy and Renew Home recently announced plans to launch a 1 gigawatt VPP in Texas by 2035, equivalent to roughly a dozen gas-fired peaker plants, and doing this by leveraging flexible demand from smart thermostats. This announcement comes just months after the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT, revised its 2030 load growth forecast to 148 gigawatts, an increase of 40 gigawatts from last year's forecasts. And there are many other examples I could mention, but we still need to see broader industry adoption at all levels to address the challenges slowing down VPP adoption today. Inaction is too expensive. Enhancing the grid in the near term is critical to America's economic growth and to our ability to retain and strengthen our global leadership. At the DOE, we have a lot of work underway, both within our offices, jiggers, VPPs, and across the agency, and with our external partners to enable VPP deployment. And Jigger, I want to come back to you with another question here. Can you share just a glimpse of the programs? I know there are 60 or more of them mentioned in this report that have been underway or newly established by DOE and our collaborators to accelerate VPP liftoff.
Totally, Marcos. The DOE and its partners are at the forefront of fostering an ecosystem that not only supports but accelerates the adoption and integration of VPPs into our energy system. At DOE, we're taking a wraparound approach to reach stakeholders all around the ecosystem. To reach regulators and state policymakers, our Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office and Office of Electricity have newly enhanced technical assistance programs which can help regulators understand how to integrate DERs and virtual power plants into distribution and bulk power system operations in their specific grid contexts and regulatory frameworks, often to implement for Order 2222. To reach utilities, VPP companies, and consumers, thanks to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, DOE has been supporting with significant financial support as well. The Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations selected 3 projects, including Dominion Energy's project in Virginia, to coordinate distributed energy resources with control software. This provides real-time, safe, reliable, and affordable grid support and capacity without costly grid upgrades. The Grid Deployment Office selected projects including the Public Service Company of New Mexico's project to establish a VPP. This program will provide operators visibility and control over localized grid constraints to help improve service, enhance grid stability, and reduce electricity bills. And when you think about what the Loan Programs Office is doing to provide for large-scale VPPs across the country, we really have been at the forefront of that work. In December, we announced our largest loan ever of $15 billion to Pacific Gas and Electric Company, a natural gas and electric utility in California, which includes funding for battery storage, transmission upgrades, and virtual power plants throughout PG&E's service area. Among our utility applicants, we are seeing more and more plans for VPP enabling investments. Our funding is also providing financial support to developers of distributed energy resources who are deploying VPP-ready devices. For example, in December, we announced a conditional commitment to Nostromo Energy to deploy and aggregate 193 cold thermal energy storage installations at commercial buildings across California, basically making ice off-peak and then blowing air over it on peak to cool buildings. We are also announcing a conditional commitment to SunWealth to deploy up to 1,000 solar systems and battery energy storage systems across 27 states. These systems can be aggregated into virtual power plants to benefit communities by lowering utility bills and increasing energy resilience. The momentum for VPPs isn't defined just to DOE. External organizations are playing a pivotal role in facilitating a broader understanding and adoption of VPPs across the energy sector. For instance, NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and NASIO, the National Association of State Energy Officials, published a guidebook on the fundamentals of aggregated distributed energy resources just a couple of months ago. This is part of their DER integration and compensation curriculum, an initiative that provides regulators and state energy officials with the practical guides to VPP grid services, valuation options, approaches to compensation, and detailed case studies of real VPPs and the processes states followed to develop these programs. Also, in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, there were tax credits to reduce the cost of distributed energy resources for consumers through programs such as home energy rebates and weatherization assistance programs administered by our state and local programs. Similarly, RMI's Virtual Power Plant Partnership, or VP3, has made significant contributions in developing utility VPP case studies through their VPP Flipbook, analyzing the emissions reductions benefits of VPPs, publishing policy principles, and more. A nonprofit published a model tariff and model legislation to support state regulators, policymakers, and utilities in implementing VPP supportive regulatory mechanisms after this gap was identified in the 2023 VPP Liftoff Report. The topics that VPPs cover are vast, and the breadth of organizations and programs working on accelerating adoption reflects that.
Yeah, thank you, Jigger. And wow, there's so much going on both at DOE and in the broader ecosystem. Really impressive and really exciting, and therefore extremely relevant for us to be updating this VPP Liftoff report now. I know, seeing in the chat, there's some questions about that. We will soon be handing it off some of the experts who helped draft the report, run through some slides. Just closing out on a few more points here. The national labs are also providing analytics that are foundational to this ecosystem. For example, the market and retail rate know-how of the energy transition or market initiative is studying VPPs, including developing a publicly available inventory, publishing 30 strategies to simplify VPP enrollment, and sharing the key barriers and solutions to FERC Order 2222 compliance. All this progress reflects a couple broader trends in the VPP market that foreshadow what's to come. First, industry acceptance. That's what it's all about. It's clear that utilities are embracing VPPs. VPPs are becoming integral to how we run our distribution systems in some parts of the country. And there are some innovative models of how this can happen, such as Green Mountain Power's partnership with Tesla, which allows customers to lease batteries, providing customers a backup power option, and the utility a critical resource to shift and shape demand, especially in times of peak load. Second, continued interest in distributed energy resources. Individual households and businesses continue to install distributed energy resources for their own use and are increasingly recognizing their secondary use to help the grid. And they're getting paid for it. According to Wood Mackenzie, DER capacity is expected to grow by 217 gigawatts in the next 5 years across DER types. Tapping into these resources that are already on the grid or expected to be deployed is just common sense. There's definitely more work to be done to increase access to those DERs. Utilities are using innovative financial mechanisms to make DERs more affordable. One example is Duke Energy, which is offering customers low-cost financing options for heat pumps through their Improve and Save program. We can expect to see more and more of that. Finally, more standardization efforts in targeted areas. This can reduce complexity and cost of implementation, increase reliability of performance, and ensure cyber-secure systems, incredibly important. For example, Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, and Kraken are just announced the Mercury Consortium, which rationalizes and increases adoption of standards for flexible demand devices to improve communications between VPP platforms and DERs. It's incredible to see the breadth of activity happening in this market, from the deployments in industry to the loans that LPO has provided to the programs and initiatives EERE and many other offices are leading around the building here at DOE, it's clear that action in the VPP space is accelerating. And there's more work to be done. Thank you, Jigger, for such an insightful discussion. And I'm thrilled to be introducing Sonali Razdan, who was until very recently in the loan programs office and just hopped over to our Office of Technology Transitions team, but we're all one big team here at DOE. But grateful for that on-ramp, Jigger. Sonali is going to share some insights from the VPP Liftoff Report, gathered from interviewing over 100 industry stakeholders and dozens of DOE experts. Her presentation promises to spark further dialogue on scaling at VPPs for a reliable, affordable, and resilient energy future. Sonali, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marcos, and thank you, Jigger, for such an insightful start to this webinar. Hello, everyone. My name is Sonali Razdan. I'm a senior advisor with the Loan Programs Office and the Office of Technology Transitions at DOE, and I'm super excited to be speaking to you all about virtual power plants today. While I do recognize that it's worthwhile to read all 100 pages of the report that we just released, I'll use the next 25 minutes or so to share the major highlights. And I'm glad to hear that a lot of you want to see slides, because we have a lot of slides that we're going to review over the next 25 to 30 minutes, really talking about the criticality of virtual power plants, especially given the near-term grid pressures that Jigger and Marcos mentioned earlier, sharing real VPP deployments that are providing real benefits to the grid and to communities. And these proven solutions can be adopted and adapted nationwide to accelerate liftoff. So let's dive in. As we mentioned earlier in the discussion, the near-term pressures on the US electric grid have intensified. And this primarily comes down to a couple of different factors. First, rapid growth in electricity demand is impacting reliability, because the grid needs to be able to balance supply and demand. Traditionally, this meant having enough supply to meet rapidly growing demand. Second, affordability. Growing capital investments, especially on the transmission and distribution grids, are placing upward pressure on customer costs. This is while 1 in 4 households are already struggling to pay their energy bills. And finally, resilience. Increasingly common extreme weather events are impacting resilience, causing power outages for households and businesses across the country. The culmination of these challenges necessitate historic investments to shore up our electric grid, costs that may fall on ratepayers already burdened by rising energy bills. So recognizing each of these grid pressures, what does the data actually tell us? Well, starting with grid reliability, peak demand is growing, and it's growing faster than we're able to anticipate. On this page, you'll see projections for US summer peak hour demand by year between 2023 and 2030. Peak hour demand is the maximum point-in-time demand that the grid must serve. From 2024 to 2030, according to NERC's latest projections from December of 2024, peak demand is expected to increase from about 800 gigawatts to 900 gigawatts. This is a massive increase of 100 gigawatts over the next 6 years, driven by growth in energy-intensive data centers, domestic manufacturing, and electrification of transport and heating. But that's not all. Not only is peak demand growing, it's growing faster than we're able to predict. As you can see, peak demand forecasts keep getting revised upwards over time. The 2030 forecast jumped by 50 gigawatts just in the last year. So clearly, these forecasts are continuing to evolve rapidly. This uncertainty increases the importance of prioritizing the most cost-effective and flexible resources, such as virtual power plants. For affordability, capital investments in transmission and distribution systems are growing to meet rising load growth and to replace aging assets. On this page, you can see the annual capital expenditures by sector over time. While these capital costs have historically been generally stable or following inflation, distribution costs in particular have grown rapidly in the last 10 years, outpacing all other grid capital costs. From 2022 to 2023, just in 1 year, distribution capital investments grew by close to 15%. and they're expected to continue growing. According to the annual energy outlook from the EIA, transmission and distribution prices are expected to continue growing by another 12% between 2023 and 2030. This is after accounting for inflation and while total electricity prices decline. These rising energy costs place pressure on households, especially low-income Americans who are already struggling to pay their energy bills today. And while there are challenges for meeting grid reliability and affordability, the aging infrastructure of the grid itself is being placed under immense pressure by increasingly frequent extreme weather events. The number of billion-dollar climate and weather events has doubled over the last 10 years. In 2023 alone, the US experienced a record 28 separate billion-dollar climate disasters that caused $95 billion of damage and injury. The majority of outages, close to 80%, are due to these extreme weather events. So it's clear there are a lot of near-term pressures that the grid is facing. Against the backdrop of this, virtual power plants are among the critical solutions that can address these near-term challenges and build a reliable, affordable, and resilient grid for all Americans. Why? Well, because basic virtual power plants are quick to deploy. They can be launched in less than 6 months to meet rapid load growth. They are low cost, both on the bulk power grid and on the distribution grid, because they help defer necessary upgrades and maximize utilization of the assets we've already paid for. All while they provide backup power options to communities during emergencies, such as extreme weather events. Before diving into each of these in more detail, let's take a quick moment and pause to recall the definition of a virtual power plant. As mentioned in the 2023 Liftoff Report, virtual power plants are aggregations of distributed energy resources, or DERs, like rooftop solar with batteries, EVs and chargers, smart appliances, and flexible commercial and industrial loads. These aggregations help balance both the demand and supply. For additional background on VPPs, DERs, their business models, technology, deployment potential, please reference the 2023 VPP Liftoff Report. So as mentioned before, basic virtual power plants are quick to deploy. They can be launched in less than 6 months by tapping into DERs that are already on the grid or expected to be deployed. Wood Mackenzie estimates that 217 gigawatts of DER capacity is expected to come online in the next 5 years. This existing and expected capacity can serve as the foundation for fast launching, large-scale virtual power plants. In comparison, traditional approaches to increasing grid capacity, such as utility-scale batteries and gas peaker plants, are facing lengthening delays, whether that be due to clogged interconnection queues, or lengthy permitting timelines, or long lead times due to supply chain delays. Rapid demand growth requires rapid solutions, such as virtual power plants. Deploying VPPs can buy us time for the construction of higher capacity assets and increase the value of grid assets that Americans have already paid for. As one example of a VPP that has deployed quickly, National Grid launched its successful Connected Solutions program in less than 4 months, which now provides up to 250 megawatts of peak shaving benefits. In addition to being quick to deploy, VPPs are lower cost solutions. When comparing the net cost of providing 400 megawatts of resource adequacy, VPPs can be lower cost than procuring the same capacity from a natural gas peaker plant or a utility scale battery. These savings, as well as reduced distribution and transmission costs, accrue to all ratepayers, not just VPP participants. Beyond these system benefits for all ratepayers, customers enrolled in the VPP can also accrue additional benefits in the form of incentives. As a real-world example, Con Edison deferred a $1.2 billion substation upgrade in 2014, instead spending $200 million on DERs and demand reduction measures as part of the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. And of course, as mentioned, VPPs also build resilience for communities. For example, Green Mountain Power's Zero Outages initiative combines traditional resilience approaches with energy storage deployment through batteries and microgrids. So now that we've recognized the value of VPPs in addressing the near-term grid pressures, what is the scale that they can get to by 2030? Well, deploying 80 to 160 gigawatts of VPPs by 2030, or roughly 10 to 20% of peak load, could support rapid load growth while reducing overall grid costs, meeting the trifecta: grid reliability, affordability, and resilience. Today, if you look at the left-hand side of this chart, the height of the first bar indicates that VPPs serve roughly 30 gigawatts of the 800 gigawatts of US peak electricity demand. Between today and 2030, roughly 100 gigawatts of old power plants are expected to retire. Between the same time period, demand is also expected to increase by 100 gigawatts, from 800 to 900 gigawatts. So if we do some quick math, we can see that 100 gigawatt of demand growth and 100 gigawatts of potential retirements implies that roughly 200 gigawatts of coincident peak demand must be served with new resources added to the grid by 2030. VPPs could serve a lot of that by tripling in scale to meet 80 to 160 gigawatts of the 200 gigawatts of peak demand needs. This is while reducing grid costs, improving grid reliability, and building community resilience. By growing VPPs to that scale, we could meet 10 to 20% of peak load while saving on the order of $10 billion in grid costs from peaker plants, T&D upgrades, and fuel. This translates to savings for ratepayers. So what will it take to actually get there? The pathway to commercial liftoff for VPPs requires progress along 5 imperatives. First, expanding DER adoption with equitable benefits. Second, simplifying VPP enrollment. Third, increasing standardization in VPP operations. And this standardization will help integrate VPPs both into utility planning and incentives, or the 4th imperative, and wholesale markets, or the 5th imperative. Now, for the rest of our session today, I'll talk briefly about each of these imperatives and give real-world examples or updated market analyses of proven solutions that can be adopted in all of your jurisdictions. But this will be just a small glimpse of the over 75 case studies included in the full 2025 update. So starting with the first imperative, expanding DER adoption with equitable benefits, even though DER capacity is expected to increase rapidly, DER adoption today is still a fraction of its potential. For example, only 3.5% of households have rooftop solar and 13% have smart thermostats. Low DER adoption will limit the available capacity for virtual power plants and reduce the speed at which VPPs can be deployed. To expand DER adoption and ensure the benefits are enjoyed by all communities, we need DERs to be more affordable. High upfront costs and limited low-cost financing options today limit who is able to purchase a DER, which in turn limits who can benefit from DER ownership through lower energy bills, backup power, improved air quality outcomes, and more. Various industry actors are implementing solutions today that can be replicated to address these barriers. For example, San Diego Community Power launched the Solar Battery Savings Program a couple months ago. This VPP uses upfront incentives to lower the initial cost of purchasing solar and batteries for all customers. For income-qualified populations in particular, Community Power worked with state and local programs to make sure their incentives could stack with other programs and cover the entire cost of solar and storage through available incentives. Community Power is able to use these batteries every single day for 2 hours to reduce peak demand on their grid while saving costs for their customers. The program has been so successful that they hit their budget cap in just 3 months due to high customer interest. It's clear that customers want these assets for the lower energy bills, for the backup power options. And in our full update, we include 13 case studies that share additional levers that stakeholders can consider. These levers range from improving DER access for multifamily buildings to innovative financial mechanisms that increase access to low-cost financing, all to achieve the objective of expanding DER adoption with equitable benefits. Next, we need these DERs to actually participate in virtual power plants. And to do that, enrolling these DERs into available programs and simplifying the VPP enrollment process is critical. Now, DER capacity is expected to grow and grow rapidly. And this growth isn't limited to any particular state. In fact, every state across the US is expected to see some growth in DER capacity, though the magnitude of that growth and the types of DERs that come online will vary from state to state. For example, if we look at California over here, they have EV chargers and fuel generators and batteries that comprise the majority. On the other hand, Maine has about 50% of its dispatchable capacity coming from fuel generators alone. DER capacity growth is great and important, but on its own, it could strain existing aging distribution systems that are already near maximum capacity during peak events. Instead, enrolling these DERs into virtual power plants would integrate these resources into system planning, effectively managing impacts to the distribution system while unlocking additional reliability, affordability, and resilience value for ratepayers. With a baseline forecast of DER adoption and demonstrated best-in-class VPP enrollment rates, VPPs can actually meet liftoff of 10 to 20% of peak demand by 2030. Looking at this chart, starting from the left-hand side, today, we have roughly 30 gigawatts of VPP capacity serving the grid. If we were to continue enrolling DERs into VPPs at the current enrollment rate, we would expect another 25 gigawatts of capacity. The interesting scenarios are the next two on this page. Implementing no regrets and high impact enrollment practices can enroll an additional 25 to 100 gigawatts of capacity to meet 10 to 20% of peak demand. To unlock these higher enrollment scenarios, stakeholders need to prioritize implementing these no regrets and high impact actions. For no regrets actions, even strategies as simple as improving communications to highlight the benefits of enrollment, especially the financial benefits, are a low effort, high impact action that cooperatives such as Minkota is adopting. To achieve higher enrollment rates, as we see in the third enrollment scenario, strategies such as point of purchase enrollment and automatic enrollment with opt-out can dramatically improve conversion. For example, a study by Uplight actually found that over 60% of eligible customers purchasing a smart thermostat would enroll in programs when they offer the option at the point of sale. And utilities are actually adopting these practices, such as Arizona Public Service that has an online marketplace for their Cool Rewards program. Making it as simple as possible for consumers is critical. This way, these assets can not only serve customers, but also provide critical benefits to the grid. In our full update, we have 9 additional case studies that showcase a variety of other strategies that are helping to simplify VPP enrollment. Next, we need more standardization in VPP operations so that VPP models that work in one jurisdiction, like the few that we've already referenced today, can be rapidly replicated across the country. There has been a ton of innovation in virtual power plants, in the DERs that they aggregate, in the grid services that they provide, and the increasing frequency of dispatch. But the flip side of that innovation is complexity among VPP providers. Luckily, DOE and other industry actors have launched or expanded efforts to standardize various areas of VPP operations. From the communication protocols between VPPs and utilities, all the way to cybersecurity for DERs, there are various standardization efforts underway. This type of standardization could accelerate integration of virtual power plants, both into how utilities operate and how wholesale markets operate. As an example of a standardization initiative, EPRI launched Flexit to deliver the technical specifications necessary for providing DER visibility, and to establish standards for the core utility to VPP interactions required when providing grid services. These standardization efforts and the other 9 referenced in the report are critical to reducing complexity and accelerating deployment. In the report, there are more detailed descriptions of each of these efforts alongside the information technology and operational technology configurations, or IT and OT configurations, that enable 3 successful utility-led VPPs in this country. Now, increased standardization will facilitate integrating virtual power plants into utility planning and incentives. For investor-owned utilities in particular, state policymakers and regulators can play a key role and are playing a key role in integrating virtual power plants into utility planning and compensation models as part of their role in directing and overseeing grid plans and investment strategies. And the value of the role they play is clear. Across the US, VPP deployment has been highest in the states where state regulators and our policymakers have implemented VPP supportive actions. On this map, if you look at each of the states, the number in each state indicates the number of VPP deployments that have been launched. The darkness of the color indicates the total VPP-related policy and regulatory actions in that state. So states such as New York, Texas, Massachusetts, North Carolina, California are some states that have a significant amount of both deployments and policy and regulatory related actions. And you can see that there's a general correlation between the two. So clearly, regulators and policymakers have an absolutely critical role to play in accelerating VPP deployment and achieving liftoff. And there are a variety of ways that they can approach supporting deployment. Examples include establishing utility cost recovery methods for VPP-related investments, just like Vermont's Public Utility Commission did by allowing Green Mountain Power to include certain customer lease DERs as part of their capital investment plan. Other examples include developing DER aggregation models and deployment requirements, like the Texas PUC has done, to establish an aggregated DER pilot program and enable third-party aggregation of DERs. And there are many other examples included in this report. State by state, regulators and policymakers will have different policy contexts and starting points of regulatory frameworks that can be used or adjusted to encourage virtual power plant deployment. These example actions discussed in more depth in the report provide a menu of the 22 real-world options that can be tailored to help state regulators and policymakers meet their state's context and grid objectives while reducing costs for ratepayers. And finally, let's turn to wholesale markets. As of 2020, the 6 regional wholesale power markets that are regulated by the Federal Electric Reliability Corporation, or FERC, are required by Order 2222 to allow participation by aggregations of DERs. In other words, VPPs. That means it's no longer a matter of whether wholesale markets will allow virtual power plants, but rather when and how. Implementation plans across the various markets have had a lot of different approaches. So if we look at ISO RTO compliance, they really vary by market based on region-specific challenges. CAISO, NISO, and ISO New England are leading implementation, while PJM, MISO, and SPP are seeking to implement much of their compliance several years later. Of the market operators, only CAISO and ISO New England have fully complied with the requirements of FERC Order 2222. When we actually look at the compliance plans, a lot of them exhibit individualized, disparate approaches to wholesale market participation for DERs. This results in a patchwork of rules and requirements that really make it difficult for aggregators to scale across jurisdictions and replicate proven models. While some variation is expected, the degree of variation across regions is introducing delays and adding costs. One industry analysis estimates that standardizing ISO and RTO metering and settlement approaches alone could create $75 billion in savings due to reductions in data computing, storage, and management costs. So it's clear that there's still a lot of work to be done to integrate virtual power plants into wholesale markets. But there are several emerging solutions to address some of these challenges, both domestically and internationally. And market operators, utilities, state policymakers, and regulators all have a role to play in advancing those. In the report, we've included 6 case studies of various options market operators can consider, as well as 3 levers for state regulators and policymakers to consider to more fully integrate virtual power plants into wholesale markets. The potential solutions I've highlighted involve a particularly wide range of stakeholders. On the consumer end of the value chain, we need involvement of community organizations, financial institutions, DER developers, retailers, and more. On the grid operations side, we need utilities to get involved, national labs, regulators, state policymakers, and market operators to step up. And of course, as the Department of Energy, we have a critical role to play. In our report, we have included over 60 supportive actions that DOE and our collaborators are taking to support virtual power plant deployment, ranging from low-cost financing for projects through our loan programs office, grant funding for grid resilience, or technical support for regulators, and much, much more. Tripling the scale of virtual power plants to meet 10 to 20% of peak demand by 2030 will not be easy, but it's urgent. It's time to move beyond pilots and patchwork deployment to VPPs at scale. The great news is we have all these proven solutions that we can pull from. Over 75 examples highlighted in our update, so we do not need to start from scratch. Adopting and adapting these demonstrated best practices and using the tools and resources we already have available in front of us can accelerate action to address near-term grid needs and achieve liftoff. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take questions during this time, but thank you all so much for tuning in early on a Wednesday morning. If we've been successful at piquing your interest, we do hope you check out the full 2025 update at liftoff.energy.gov/VPP. We at the Department of Energy look forward to hearing from you. We do very much welcome feedback, as well as working with all of you to accelerate virtual power plant deployment and reach liftoff. Thank you all so much for joining, and have a wonderful week ahead.